Sziasztok, a Madison Square Parkból jelentkezem New Yorkból. Itt fogok beszélgetni Amy Goodmannel, aki a Democracy Now! Alapító, főszerkesztő, vezető, műsorvezetője.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
A Democracy Now! Az egyik legfontosabb, független, non-profit média szervezet itt az államokban, hogy pontosan mi a jelentőségük, ez ki fog derülni az interjúból, amiben érintjük az iraki megszállás 20. évfordulóját, úgy általában az amerikai média működést és a politikával való viszonyát, de kitérünk majd az ukrajnai háborús helyzetre is. Kezdjük. Hello, Amy Goodman.
Hi, it's great to be with you.
Thank you very much for accepting this interview with me. Thanks a lot, really, I appreciate your time. I would like to start with a question related to your book, which was published in 2016. It had the same title as your platform, Democracy Now! And I want to quote you because you said in your book that the main goal of Democracy Now! Is to go to where the silence is and give voice to the movements that are shaping our world. Can the phrase, go to where the silence is, be described as your journalistic mission statement?
Yes, no question. Go to where the silence is. And you know, that often is not really silent. I mean, there are so many people organizing at the grassroots, but it just doesn't hit the corporate media radar. I think it's the role of independent media to bring out those voices. And I really do think that, like, those that are deeply concerned about war and peace, those who are concerned about the climate, those who are concerned about LGBTQ issues, those who are concerned about racial and economic and social justice, are not a fringe minority, and they're not a silent majority, but they're the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take the media back.
I found it very important that you are emphasizing the importance of movements rather than single activists.
You know, the focus of the media is often the president or a general fighting a war, but it's the movements. You can have leaders and movement-appointed leaders, but it's the movements and the people willing to be arrested on the front lines that ultimately make change permanent. That's why 90% of life and reporting is showing up, is being there. And you hear these eloquent voices and describing conditions on the ground. That is the most authentic form of media, is showing how people live, showing what people are doing in their communities. In the United States, for so many years, most people didn't vote. People don't realize that in the rest of the world. We have a very low rate of voting, but people have been engaged, and it's important to see what people are engaged in. And the more you give voice to the grassroots, the more people will get involved, even in electoral politics, because they can see that they make a difference.
And how do you explain that despite all of this enormous effect of these movements, so they were widespread, they were popular, even among corporate media. They made coverage of Occupy Wall Street and they interviewed the leaders or the main activists of the movement. The movement was not capable of having serious impact of the government, political decisions, how they would handle the ongoing crisis. Why is that?
I do think that movements make a difference, but I think it is slow. When you have, for example, the civil rights movement, it is never fast enough. When you have the Black Lives Matter movement, it makes an enormous difference, and it inspires people, young people who are looking at the changing hue of Congress and who can be in Congress. It takes time, and I think it's sped up when those voices are amplified on a show like Democracy Now! Look at the effect of the Black Lives Matter movement. Yes, George Floyd was murdered by police.
Yes.
And then after that, another person is murdered by the police. But the movement and the awareness continues to grow. I mean, you cannot change the world in one fell swoop. You can't achieve democracy once and for all. you have to fight for it every single day.
You know, I think you have always faced accusations that you are more likely an activist rather than a journalist. How do you deal with the concept of activist journalism? Do you even think that activism and journalism can be two separated identities?
To present the view of activists is not to be one of them yourself.
Okay.
If you present the view of the president, as the corporate media does all the time, quoting the president, Congress members, are the journalists presidential? Are the journalists congressional? No. But they're so busy presenting the view of the establishment. We have to show it all, to show the whole gamut. I'll give you an example. In 2016, that was the presidential race, but ultimately between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And you had in North Dakota this remarkable movement. We'd never seen anything like this in the United States. Thousands of indigenous people rising up against the Dakota Access Pipeline that would cross their territory, go under the Missouri River, the longest river in North America. And they were concerned it would pollute the water of millions of people downstream. They were taking on pipeline politics. They were fighting for a sustainable planet. And we reported on it for a while. But then, I mean, when the presidential candidates were being questioned by the so-called journalists, the moderators, they weren't asked one question about climate change. Forget whether they were asked about the standoff at Standing Rock. That's what it was called. It was the Standing Rock Sioux. About climate change, a key issue of our time. And so we felt we had to go out there. We had to show people what was happening on the ground. And through that, you see what's happening on the planet. And so we went there. We showed the protests. We showed people trying to plant tribal flags on their burial ground, and the Dakota Access Pipeline security guards unleashing dogs on the protesters. I mean, President Obama at the time, he knew what that was about. I mean, unleashing dogs on protesters happened in the 1960s when dogs were unleashed on African Americans. And here they were being released on Native Americans. They were biting the people. We showed a dog with its mouth and its nose dripping with blood. And we showed people standing up, not only for themselves, they said, but for everyone. And does that mean we're an activist? We're active in ensuring that you show the voice of the majority of people. But that's not what's reflected in the rest of the media. So in that sense, we're very active in ensuring that all voices are heard.
Absolutely, and you have a historical record in doing that. And that's why I'm interested, because right now we are sitting in 2023. This is the 20th anniversary of the Iraqi invasion. And before the war, there was the largest worldwide protest in the history of humankind. So there were 36 million people protesting on the streets, the biggest one in Italy, the biggest one in Europe, the biggest one in America, just to ask the decision makers to stop the war. And these efforts didn't prevent the war to burst out in Iraq. What is your explanation?
I mean, that's a very good question. The fact that the world rocking the planet for peace on February 15, 2003 didn't stop that war. It still creates a through line to stop the next war. President Bush launched a most unpopular war. And I think about a few weeks later, all the media showed the statue of Saddam Hussein being pulled down in Firdos Square in Baghdad. And I want to use the example of CNN. It actually is two networks, CNN Domestic and CNN International. CNN Domestic just showed that statue coming down. I mean, we saw it 1,000 times as if it had a life of its own. You didn't even see right out of the frame was the U.S. Marines pulling that statue down. They talked about the people pulling it down. But CNN International knew that they could not get away with showing the war as a statue falling down, that too many thousands of people were dying, and they had the images. And so on CNN International, they had a split screen. They showed the statue coming down, but they also showed the casualties of war. Now that just shows CNN had access to all of that domestically in the United States. It's what it feeds the population, how, as Noam Chomsky says, how it manufactures consent for war. And it's our job to show the grit, to show the horror.
Yes, you're talking about how the corporate media are dampening the impact of anti-war movements, but I'm seriously interested that how Democracy Now! Can counter the effect of corporate media.
I mean, I know what every establishment journalist thinks on so many issues. I mean, so often, for example, when it comes to war, you have the journalists climbing into the tank to show what it feels like to drive the tank or what the dashboard looks like, or getting in one of those fighter jets and showing us how it works. But I think it's our job as journalists to be at the target end of where those bombs fall, to show what it's like to be there on the ground.
Do you think in the past 20 years, this pro-war stance of the corporate media has changed? And let's assume for the better?
I would say that the media tends to circle the wagons around the White House. That's what it is called patriotic, especially in a time of war. And that's not our job. That's when the most serious questions have to be raised. We have to be different than the corporate media. We have to be a democratic, independent media. We need a media, when we cover war, that's not brought to us by the weapons manufacturers. When we cover the level of gun violence we have in the United States, that's not brought to us by the arms manufacturers. When we cover climate change, that's not brought to us by the oil, the gas, the coal companies. When we cover inequality, that's not brought to us by the financial institutions. We need a media that's brought to us by the listeners, the viewers, the readers that need information to decide how to move forward.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about Democracy Now! Itself. So how would you been able to build up such a strong network with so many stations worldwide? It seems to me a quite interesting phenomenon, so please expand on this.
Democracy Now! Is not alone. We are a daily, grassroots, global, unembedded, independent, international investigative news hour. We started on 9 radio stations in 1996. Only for 9 months we're the only daily election show in public broadcasting. But when that election happened, President Clinton was elected for the second time, all the stations wanted more of a show that really focused on what was happening on the ground. And so we kept growing. And in 2001, when the terror attacks happened, September 11th, we started broadcasting on one TV station, and then it just took off. More and more TV stations, public television stations, and more radio stations, and now we're on 1,500 public television and radio stations around the world. And what also makes us unique is that we are global. And, we live in a globalized world, yet people in the United States are so insular when it comes to getting information, although it's so much easier, especially with the internet, to get information from all over. And we try to break the sound barrier and bring out the voices of people all over.
Is the funding model of Democracy Now! Sustainable? So can you talk a little bit about how do you cover your budget year by year?
I mean, we are independent. We don't turn to the weapons manufacturers or the oil companies. We don't turn to the banks.
So not even a foundation which accepts money from the oil industry can give you funds?
We're covered by listeners, by viewers, by readers, by some foundations. It's the way we move forward. We don't have anything like the budget of the corporate media, but it makes
What's the difference?
I don't know. It's nowhere near. Nowhere near.
Okay.
But I think people find Democracy Now! Because of its authentic voice. Very diverse, younger audience, people who want to hear some kind of echo of their own reality.
Has Democracy Now! Always been audience funded?
Yes.
That's great.
We come out of the Pacifica Radio Network. We're independent. But Pacifica Radio was founded in 1949, right after World War II, in Berkeley, California. The first station was KPFA. It was a radio station founded by a war resistor who, when he came out of the detention camp, said, there has to be a media outlet that's not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. It became 5 stations, Los Angeles, New York, Washington, and Houston. And when the Houston station went on the air in what we call the Petro Metro, Houston, Texas, oil capital, in 1970, within a few weeks, it was blown up by the Ku Klux Klan, that white supremacist organization. They strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter. And when KPFT got back on their feet a few weeks later, rebuilt the transmitter, they strapped 15 times the dynamite to the base of the transmitter, and they blew it up again. So then it took months for KPFT to get back on the air, and in 1971 they did. And I can't remember if it was the Exalted Cyclops or the Grand Dragon. Those are the titles of the leaders of the Ku Klux Klan. I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. That's because he understood how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves.
Wow.
And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it is an uncle in Afghanistan or an aunt in Iraq, you say, that sounds like my aunt, my bubba, my baby. And you may not agree with the person, but it makes you much less likely that you'll want to destroy them. That understanding is the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, it's all too often wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take the media back.
It's fascinating. How have you been able to reach your audience and build such a strong and committed community to sustain Democracy Now! Right now it's for more than a quarter of a century?
Yes, it's because it's been global from the beginning. When the networks are paying for their satellites, we couldn't afford that. And so we were online from the beginning. The internet is free. And we were, making available the show to radio stations. We used the internet to send it. Even the video, we perfected a way to send broadcast quality video through the internet. When we were having our reports from Iraq or from Egypt in 2011 during the Arab Spring, the rest of the media relied on satellites. And when the thugs brought down those satellites, they didn't know how to send their media. We always sent it through the internet because we couldn't afford the satellites. And so we were the ones with these 25-minute reports from Tahrir Square with our reporters on the ground and using the internet in that way to send the show out all different ways and also to transcribe the show so that it was available for people to take the White House to the State Department to read the transcripts every day. In the same way, people could support Democracy Now! They could, donate online at democracynow.org. And it just kept growing. And so as we went from 9 stations to 1,500 stations, then people everywhere know how they can support this media outlet.
Wow. So it's a public funded media. Do you consider Democracy Now! As public media?
It is public. It's public and community.
I'm really interested about your understanding what public media has as a function in a developed society, because there is an ongoing debate in Hungary about our public media is heavily occupied by the government. It's directly controlled by the government. I can say that with confidence. And there is an ongoing debate among opposition fractions, parties, circles, saying that we need a more balanced media. But I don't think public media should be balanced. It should balance the inequalities among different groups in the society to empower those who are lacking the necessary economic or political power. So what would be your understanding of the role of public media?
I mean, I think it's all of those things. I think we have to challenge those in power, and we do have to bring out the voices that are so often completely excluded, marginalized, but they're not they're not a fringe minority. They really do represent many people's views in this country. They're just not reflected in the corporate media. So we have a special responsibility to bring out those voices, to include them in the discussion and the debate, and not exclude the others. So we have two jobs. One is to cover those in power and to cover the movements that are surging forward. And the other is to deconstruct the narrative that the rest of the media presents. Why do we think a certain way about the rest of the world? You know, people in the United States see the world through a corporate lens, and that has to be challenged. And also dangerously, the rest of the world sees the United States through a corporate lens. We have to smash through that. We have to have an independent lens, covering those who profit and those who don't profit. It's covering these supranational organizations that, like the World Trade Organization, that's overturning the laws of democratically elected legislatures, showing people how that works. Also, another key issue is the safety of journalists and fighting against the repression of journalists, wherever that might be. Whether we're talking about Julian Assange, who's been in the Belmarsh prison in London now for 4 years, but really in captivity for a decade before that. He faces over 100 years in prison in the United States. He's been charged with espionage because he published the secrets of the United States around the Iraq War, the Afghan War, State Department secrets. At Democracy Now!, I've been, unfortunately, threatened with arrest or arrested a number of times, and we have to fight this at every level. We were covering the Democratic National Convention in Denver when Barack Obama was first nominated. Then we flew to St. Paul when he was running against John McCain, the Republican. And that first day, just like there were protests in Denver to let the Democratic Party know people were against war, there were those protests at the Republican convention. We went to cover those. Immediately, I got arrested with my colleagues.
Yes.
And that's not acceptable. We should not have to get a record when we put things on the record. When the lead up to the Iraq War, there was a group of women, prominent women, who went to Washington, like the writer Alice Walker, Maxine Hung Kingston, and others who stood in front in Lafayette Park. And I was interviewing them, putting them on radio stations, asking them questions, and the first one to be arrested was me. And they were willing to be arrested. They had no right to arrest a journalist that was simply bringing out their voice to the rest of the world. That is completely unacceptable. When we were covering the standoff at Standing Rock, when we showed the level of repression against the indigenous activists who were fighting against the Dakota Access Pipeline, we came back to New York, we showed the video online, and the North Dakota authorities issued an arrest warrant for me. Why? Because we were showing the images. So we also feel, just like we have to deconstruct the narrative of the media, we had to go back to North Dakota to face the charges, especially to let young journalists know you don't have to go to jail to cover these epic protests like we've never seen before. So we went back, we challenged the authorities, and ultimately, though they were going to charge me with felony, for which I could face a long time in jail. When there's public pressure, when the media shines its light in the right direction, they have to back down.
I can say with confidence that you have a historical record, historical achievements when you were covering anti-war movements, when you were giving platform to people who organized the Occupy Wall Street movement, or even when you provided a platform for the unheard voices everywhere in the world, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from Asia, and so on. I can go on. So That's why I think most people in Europe consider Democracy Now! As an anti-capitalist platform. Do you consider yourself or Democracy Now! As anti-capitalist, or are you just trying to counterbalance the enormous impact of corporate media and corporations in general on American society and worldwide society, let's say that?
I mean, I think just giving voice to, as we do indigenous movements dealing with climate change, as we do giving voice to the anti-war movement and a pro-war media, we're giving voice to those who are questioning the impact of corporate capitalism.
Yes, but what's common in all of these groups that they are victims of capitalism existing in America, existing in everywhere in the world. So that's why I'm asking that whether you would consider Democracy Now! As an anti-capitalist media platform.
We're just a genuine journalistic platform that questions the power. And in the United States, that power is capitalist. And so to ask the key questions is our job, and then people can make up their own minds.
Can I ask about your own political views?
I'm not sure what you mean.
I'm asking this because I'm interested about what do you think, should journalists, explain their own political thoughts? Should they, release the information to the public, whether they voted for Democrats or Republicans? So do you think it's a kind of an information which is necessary for the public, or do you think it's an information which you should not like to reveal for the audience?
I think our job is to be fair and to be accurate. It does not matter my point of view. What matters is that people feel that they are accurately represented so that the general public can make up their mind.
But do you think if you would reveal the information about your current political views, that would impeach your journalistic objectivity?
I think that we're all entitled to our private views, but what counts for being a journalist is being fair, is being accurate, is reassessing things that we think about all the time based on new information.
And at the end of our interview, just let's talk briefly about the war in Ukraine, because I think it also has a great impact on your society, and I'm very interested about your view, because you are covering the war not just from the beginning, but even before. You had great shows on the events in the Maidan and all the Crimea insulated situation. So I'm asking this, that in your view, has the American media been covering the war in Ukraine responsibly, or has it fallen back to the uncritical pro-military patterns that it followed during the invasion of Iraq?
Well, I definitely think the corporate media, again, surrounds the White House, circles the White House when it comes to war, and stops asking the critical questions right when they should be asking the critical questions. Wars end by negotiation. The question is how soon that negotiation happens. I mean, look at what happened when the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan. And there was even a discussion about whether NATO should be disbanded. I'm sure this was very threatening to the weapons manufacturers of the United States. Now they are experiencing a level of financial bonanza when it comes to the arming of the world right now, led by the United States. We have to be extremely critical. We cannot afford, not just the United States, the world cannot afford a nuclear war. Ukraine can't afford this, Russia can't afford this, China can't afford this, the United States can't. Humanity cannot afford this. And so we have to ask very deep questions about how this war ends. And that's what we do on a regular basis.
As a pacifist media workshop, how can you resolve the dilemma that while one cannot question that helping the Ukrainians is a moral duty, it is also highly problematic that this help mainly means delivering more weapons, which, besides generating profit for the military-industrial complex, usually helps not end but prolong war. So how can you handle such a delicate issue, such a delicate problem, which you have to do on a daily basis with your shows?
I mean, we just deal with it every day by asking a wide range of questions of a wide range of people and ensuring that Ukrainian voices are always also represented.
as I'm talking to many people here in America, I'm frightened about the reality, the realization that many people are talking about we should be involved more military-wise in the ongoing conflict. And I think, being involved more military-wise would not deliver any kind of a peace negotiation.
Talking about peace is not being pro-Russian. What Putin did, this brutal, illegal invasion of Ukraine, must be challenged at every minute. But right now we're talking about the fate of the planet when it comes to the possibility of an escalation to a nuclear war. And that's why these questions are very serious. And in the end, they're about preserving life, Ukrainian life, Russian life, everyone's lives.
Okay. And my very last question. You are 66 years old. You are young enough to be on screen for decades. What is your plan? So do you see yourself as a kind of educator for upcoming new generations of journalism? Do you see yourself as a, anchor? So you would like to be on screen as long as possible. So what are your future plans for the upcoming decades?
I am deeply committed to independent media in a time of war, in a time of peace. At Democracy Now!, we are a place where young journalists come to carry out a mission. I see journalism as a mission. It's not just a profession, it's not just a trade. It's essential to the functioning of a democratic society. And I hope we can do that for as long as possible, and future generations will continue it.
And do you see Democracy Now! As an institution which will be sustainable even without your personal presence and personal involvement?
Absolutely. I hope so, that it will carry on for centuries to come.
And what will be your most important legacy in journalism? So do you think Democracy Now! Should be a worldwide entity? Do you think it would be the best if this would be, worldwide media network and many Amy Goodman in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America would do their own job?
I think there are many journalists all over the world who deeply care and understand that journalism is critical to the functioning of a democratic society. And I hope we can continue to build this platform so that it's a model everywhere for people to be able to speak for themselves and challenge those in power.
Amy Goodman, thank you very much for your time, and thanks for answering my questions, and good luck. And
thank you.
Thank you for your shows, thank you for reports, really. You are an enormous, great source of inspiration to me and to many, many people around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.